Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is The Secret Agent. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of The Secret Agent with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. The Secret Agent, A Simple Tale, is a novel by Joseph Conrad, published in 1907, considered one of the first terrorist and modern espionage novels. Conrad was born in the Polish part of the Russian Empire. His parents were somewhat of a revolutionary anarchists, and both died as the result of their activities against Russia's occupation of their homeland when Conrad was still a young child. I think this traumatic experience, besides his hate of Russia, also left Conrad with a very strong dislike and negative opinion of any type of revolutionary activities. Joseph Conrad is one of my favorite writers. I connect with his deep exploration of the individual's inner world, the dialogues with oneself, silent monologues, reasoning, and how all of it projects into the visible personalities of the protagonists of his novels. I think many people avoid Conrad because of the complexities of his writings and the personal effort it takes to understand what he's trying to say. It seems as every word he writes has a purpose and is even necessary to form the complete plot. So the reading requires a lot of attention, patience, and even rereading. Anyway, for me, Joseph Conrad is one of the greatest writers in English, ironically not being a native English speaker, which shows in his exotic and sometimes bizarre, but at the same time alluring prose. Ford Madox Ford, who collaborated with Conrad on a couple of novels, claimed to have been the one who taught Conrad English. If it is true, which most likely isn't, he did a fine job, and I would say he was as good of a language teacher as a writer. What is The Secret Agent about? It is somewhat of an analysis of an individual and his selfish reasons for the seemingly selfless or self-sacrificing and even altruistic actions. Specifically, in The Secret Agent, it is a personal look at the so-called revolutionaries, or sometimes referred to as anarchists, terrorists, etc., etc., depending from which side one views it. Basically, the book portrays the political and ideological conflicts seen through and how they affect the individuals connected to them, by choice or accidentally. A bit of the plot. The story takes place in late 19th century London, which sounds similar to Dickens, but without hope and possibility of life getting better. I also find it to be a reiteration of London Conrad describes in the beginning of Heart of Darkness, cannibalistic and conducive to malicious behavior. Then the vision of an enormous town presented itself, of a monstrous town more populous than some continents, and in its man-made might, as if indifferent to heaven's frowns and smiles, a cruel devourer of the world's light. There was room enough there to place any story, depth enough there for any passion, variety enough there for any setting, darkness enough there to bury 5 millions of lives. In the beginning, Verlag, who I don't consider the main character but rather one of them, is called to see Mr. Vladimir in an embassy of an undisclosed country, but I think Conrad hints quite obviously at what country he has in mind. The embassy pays Verlag a retainer, but Mr. Vladimir is disappointed with his services and maybe as an opportunity to redeem himself gives Verlag an idea of blowing up some significant landmark, such as the Greenwich Observatory. Later, Verlag meets with some anarchist friends, and they share their opinions about politics, capitalism, and the benefits revolution would bring to the society. In the next part, the story shifts forward to after the failed bombing, where two anarchists, Osipan and the professor, discuss the details of it. We are also introduced to the chief inspector, Heath, in charge of the investigation, and his superior, the assistant commissioner, who, in a typical fashion of a somewhat useless bureaucrat, is trying to make sure all the credit goes to him once the case is solved. The following chapter moves back on the timeline to the pre-explosion, and it gives a bit of a perspective from Verlag's wife, Winnie's point of view. Further, she insists that Verlag develops a closer relation with her brother, Stevie, so Verlag decides to take him on his mission, and later he comes back home alone and tells Winnie he took the boy to the country where he will stay a few days. They are visited by the chief inspector Heath, and Winnie discovers what really happened to her brother, and once the inspector leaves, she takes her revenge. After it, she abandons the house and runs into Asipan, and they decide to run away together. But as Asipan discovers what happened and observes how Winnie is dealing with it, he gets scared and changes the plan, with rather tragic consequences for Winnie, and that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about The Secret Agent? The novel, in a typical Conrad style, explores the hidden or concealed and often surprising dark side of the seemingly average or normal people. The plot is a temporary shift from the travel and exotic surroundings to a more static, familiar location and political theme. London of the late 19th century, not that different from today, cosmopolitan and a leading hub, well, much more European, wider, since the vast majority of its crowd was from the continent, contrary to today, where most of its folks sail from the warmer climates. But, as today, convocation of diverse ideological bands, feeling somewhat safer than back home in exercising their obscure activities, benefiting from the English obsessive need of making sure the trouble stays away from the homeland. Back then it meant keeping it across the channel on the continent. And Scotland Yard was already spending more time on the political surveillance than petty crime. And all these revolutionary activities are somewhat foreign and fault-tasting to the police. And Chief Inspector Heath, arrested within 6 paces of the anarchist nicknamed the Professor, gave a thought of regret to the world of thieves. Sane, without morbid ideals, working by routine, respectful of constituted authorities, free from all taint of hate and despair. Further, all these politically inspired activities were a sneak peek and a fuse for the coming chaos of the early 20th century, and also growing social instability that has re-emerged in the 21st century. Unhappy Europe too shall perish by the moral insanity of tied children. I don't know if I would call it prophetic, but it sure looks like the way we are heading. The Secret Agent, as most of Conrad's writings, which were based on the events he witnessed or stories he heard, was inspired by the 1894 accidental explosion of French anarchists outside the Royal Observatory in Greenwich Park. There wasn't much information collected about the event, so Conrad made it the foundation for his spy thriller and created a plot around it. The focus of the novel, not surprising for Conrad, are the characters at first glance somewhat common, but deeply explored to unmask their disturbing personalities. Adolf Verlag, seemingly your ordinary English shopkeeper, in his spare time is working for, let's call them the Russians. His job title is Agent Provocateur, which means he is supposed to create chaos that will benefit his employer. But the Russians are not happy with his service. They see him as inactive, fat and lazy, and being overpaid. The problem is he is not an ideologue and has no loyalties, and his motivation is self-benefit, money. So he sells himself to the highest bidder or any bidder willing to pay, and works for both sides. Conrad refers to Verlag as a moral nihilist, basically implying he has no guiding values nor principles outside his own well-being. Verlag's shop carries pornographic materials, 19th century Victorian England pornography, probably disappointing for today's connoisseurs, and I think this further attests to his lack of principles and putting his own benefits above everything else. Verlag also has doubts and reservations about his anarchist friends and finds their self-proclaimed higher morality false. It seems as Conrad is using Verlag, or through Verlag, venting his frustrations with anarchy and revolutionary activities which made him an orphan. The majority of revolutionists are the enemies of discipline and fatigue mostly. There are natures too, to whose sense of justice the price exacted looms up monstrously enormous, odious, oppressive, worrying, humiliating, extortionate, intolerable. Those are the fanatics. The remaining portion of social rebels is accounted for by vanity, the mother of all noble and vile illusions, the companion of poets, reformers, charlatans, prophets, and incendiaries. It seems that Conrad ridiculized the anarchists because he didn't really see them as real revolutionaries. He saw them as weak, afraid, and parasitical. Perhaps to him the real revolutionaries were his parents and individuals like them, never compromising their integrity and willing to sacrifice everything for their cause. Verlag's wife, Winnie, is presented as his contrast, self-sacrificing and thinking of others first. She puts her brothers' and mother's welfare above her own happiness. Verlag, because of his own personality, is not able to understand her and underestimates her. He thinks or would like to believe she married him out of love, and in the end he pays dearly for his misjudgment of her. He expected her to be obedient, understanding, and caring, and she was, as long as there was a reason for it. But unfortunately he killed that reason and sealed his own fate. Winnie's brother, Stevie, is a good-hearted imbecile, rather shallow because of his mental handicap, but his importance is being the reason for Winnie's actions and the tool of Verlag's and Winnie's undoing. Stevie also seems to represent the innocent victims of anarchy or revolutionary activities. Osipan is presented as an example of an anarchist or revolutionary, a rebel without a cause, a general failure in life who lives off the women who fall for his seductive but false persona. He's a bit like Verlag, without ideological convictions and scared of the possible consequences of his actions. But his reason is not money, or he doesn't believe somebody would pay for his service. In general, he feels useless and believes pretending to be anarchist is the only thing he can do, and it probably gives some meaning to his life, which paradoxically he seems to believe is meaningless. He is not much different from some youngsters today running around dressed like ninjas and painting and destroying property that is not theirs. Well, back then there was punishment for this kind of horseplay, so Asipan is a bit more cautious. Asipan's cowardness is shown through his final interaction with Winnie. I think Conrad disliked any revolutionary or anarchistic activities since they were responsible for the death of both of his parents. The personality I probably find most fascinating is the unnamed professor. Madness alone is truly terrifying, inasmuch as you cannot placate it by threats, persuasions, or bribes. He's the extreme of what the book is trying to portray, not tangible act, but the intangible of human psyche. He is as pure of an ideologue as one can get. He is an anarchist for the sake of anarchy and will settle for nothing less than the total destruction of everything. And his only consideration or aim in life is death. And the incorruptible fellow walked, averting his eyes from the odious multitude of mankind. He had no future, he disdained it, he was a force. His thoughts caressed the images of ruin and destruction. He walked frail, insignificant, shabby, miserable, and terrible in the simplicity of his idea calling madness and despair to the regeneration of the world. Nobody looked at him. He passed on unsuspected and deadly, like a pest in the street full of men. He will prepare and sell the explosives to anybody, since he is only interested in the act of elimination. He sees everybody as limited and focused on insignificant and in the long run useless actions. The professor is somewhat comparable to a modern-day suicide bomber, but he has no target nor political aim, just an act of carnage, and because of it he seems more force of nature than human, and probably he sees himself as such, a godly justice in which of course he doesn't believe, so it can be defined as a paradox. Mankind, asserted the professor with a self-confident glitter of his iron-rimmed spectacles, does not know what it wants. His convictions and beliefs might also be driven by his perfectionist nature. He is working on a perfect detonator for his explosive vest, and he seems to either go for all or nothing. The professor at times seems an obsessive workaholic, 100% focused on his invention, and wants to see it used regardless of the consequences. And this again brings to mind force of nature. There's also Michaelis, who seems to represent a weak and beaten down anarchist. He is fat like Verlac and lives off women like Osipan. After spending 20 years in prison, he prefers to stick to speaking and writing and avoids being connected to any act that could put him back behind the bars. I think all the characters are very complex, and I can do a little justice to them in this short review. In The Secret Agent, Conrad also lays a theoretical foundation for the emerging of modern terrorism. The suicide vest worn by the professor is probably the first time such a weapon is mentioned. I read in one of the books where author Paul Thoreau travels through Sri Lanka, and he's told that Tamil tigers invented the suicide vest. He challenges that by referring to The Secret Agent. I also read somewhere that the first time such a weapon was used was by the Chinese in the 1930s during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Maybe the Chinese read Conrad. Further, Verlac's failed explosion in the Greenwich Observatory had a political and social aim, just like the terrorist attacks of today. The demonstration must be against learning, science, but not every science will do. The attack must have all the shocking senselessness of gratuitous blasphemy. Since bombs are your means of expression, it would be really telling if one could throw a bomb into pure mathematics. But that is impossible. What do you think of having a go at astronomy? I think The Secret Agent was somewhat revived after the 9/11 attacks. There can be some parallels and relevance drawn between the attempted destruction of the Greenwich Observatory in the post-religion nihilistic world based on Darwinism and science, and the destruction of the World Trade Center in the post-industrial and even post-nation-state world, replaced by globalism and financial services. Also, the book's plot might relate to the deeper motivation behind the 9/11 attacks, since the book implies that the reasons behind the seemingly idealistic acts are much more pragmatic. This brings to mind another character from the book, Mr. Vladimir, who works in the embassy and gives a bit of inspiration to act to the group of the anarchists, directly to Verlag, who is working for him, acts that will benefit his country. The anarchists' meeting could be compared to radicalization of young and somewhat naive Muslim men in a mosque during Friday services. The book's relevance to today is that it shows that the terrorism is not an invention of Islam. It was practiced by the Christians before them, and there are no limits as to who can be a terrorist. Further, Conrad sees and describes many characters, Verlag, Winnie and her mother, Michaelis, and even Chief Inspector Heat, as fat or carrying excessive flesh. Perhaps he equated it, together with anarchy, as a sign or danger of the decline of the Western society. To sum it up, The Secret Agent is a dark and bleak novel, not a surprise coming from Joseph Conrad, and it does what his novels do the best: look deep inside the complexities and contradictions of the human personality, and how they manifest in and impact the individual's behavior, and it shows that there are no universal reasons for individual actions, but rather each one has their own personal reasons. Further, there are no heroes nor villains, just people being people. We can never cease to be ourselves. The book reads more like a modern thriller than a classic, and it has many elements of both. Not surprising, since Conrad straddled the timeline between the classic and modern literary period, and for anybody who has read Conrad, you would be able to guess who the author was just from the prose. Also, I think Conrad had a rather pragmatic view of the exterior world, and it often collided with his inner romanticism. All idealization makes life poorer. To beautify it is to take away its character of complexity. It is to destroy it. Leave that to the moralist, my boy. History is made by men, but they do not make it in their heads. The ideas that are born in their consciousness play an insignificant part in the march of events. History is dominated and determined by the tool and the production, by the force of economic conditions. Capitalism has made socialism, and the laws made by capitalism for the protection of property are responsible for anarchism. Conrad shows his dislike for the individuals who try to break the established civilized order and the Russians. Both groups were responsible for his parents' death and the chaos in his own life, and maybe he never forgave them. He portrays one group as weak and corrupt, and the other as dangerous and damaging to the world, and both set on destroying the Western civilization. Seems as opinions about Russia, at least in the West, have not changed much. Also, Conrad's view of Russia was kind of prophetic, since a lot of it came true during the Soviet Union and their indiscriminate backing and help for any anti-Western terrorist group. Then again, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. There are quite a few adaptations of The Secret Agent. One I really liked is a 1996 film starring Bob Hoskins, Patricia Arquette, Gerald Depardieu, Christian Bale, and above all, Robin Williams as the professor. It tries to interpret the plot as good as a movie can. For example, it takes for granted that the embassy is Russian, unlike the book, which is rather vague about it. But I think the film does a very good job portraying the characters. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback which I transformed into hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover I use grade A, naturally tan hide I buy from a tanner in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First I designed the cover, which what I did here, I took this painting of a detective investigating, looking for evidence through a magnifying glass, or looking at the world with his enlarged eye, not to miss the small details and idiosyncrasies in individuals that might create problems in the society. And I thought it abstractly related to the book's theme. This is the back with the blurb, and inside the book, inside the cover, I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be number and initial, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. It has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here. And until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.